song because if you didn't know what Hosanna means, it means save us. And so when we come to this story that Grace read for us, this is one of those moments where I can imagine that Daniel did a lot of hosannas in the midst of that den. So take out your calendar and mark today, because I'm going to use a baseball illustration. And it might not ever happen again, because I only have one. So there's this extraordinary professional baseball pitcher who performed very few extraordinary feats. He was a veteran of 21 seasons. In only one did he win more than 20 games. He never pitched a no-hitter. And only once in his career did he lead the league in any category. And that was in 1980 when he led the National League with a 2.21 earned run average. You might know who this is? Who? No, Nolan was much better than this. This is picture Don Sutton. In June of the 21st of 1986, Don Sutton rubbed shoulders with the true legends of baseball when he became the 30th pitcher in history to have 300 wins. In his own analysis of his success, he said, "I'm a grinder and I'm a mechanic. I've never considered myself flamboyant or even exceptional. But all my life, I've just found a way to get the job done." Through 2 decades, 6 presidential terms, 4 trades to other teams, he consistently did what pitchers are paid to do. He won. And with tunnel vision, he spent 21 years, 21 seasons, redefining greatness. Yet, most of us don't even know his name. In September 1986, the Inside Sports magazine called him the family sedan of the baseball mound. Right? He didn't boast a Ferrari style, of Denny McLain, and he didn't rise to stardom. He never had the Mercedes sparkle of Sandy Koufax. Don Sutton was just on the mound, getting the job done for 21 years. And there are many Ferraris and Mercedes and Porsches in the Bible. People like Paul and David and Moses who speed across the pages of our Bible, accomplishing great things for God. But Daniel is like the family sedan, right? He just is a long obedience and faithfulness in the same direction, over and over and over again. So let me recap for you where we started this series. This week is the last in this series, and we're in Daniel chapter 6. So the first time we meet Daniel, he's a young teenage boy who's been taken captive in Babylon. And even then, he's faithful, serving the Lord, taking a stand for what is right. We meet again in chapter 2, when as a young man, he was called by the king to interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And again, we see Daniel simply serving the Lord and being faithful. He shows up again in chapter 4 as a middle-aged man who, again, is called to interpret a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar, who's once again troubled. And Daniel, again, is found faithful. Then in chapter 5, which we did last week, we see him as an 80-year-old man who spent 70 plus years in Babylon. And he still hasn't veered off course. He's faithfully serving the God who has saved him over and over and over again. Now, there's a great book by Eugene Peterson called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. If you haven't read it, you should go buy it after church on Amazon, or just pull out your phone now and buy it on Amazon. He says in that book, the central reality for Christians is personal, unalterable, persevering commitment that God makes to us. Perseverance isn't a result of our own determination, it's the result of God's faithfulness. We strive in the way of faith not because we have some sort of extraordinary stamina, but because God is righteous and because God sticks with us. I don't know if you know who Eugene Peterson is, but if we read from the Message every Sunday, he's the one who interpreted the Hebrew and Greek text and gave us the message. But he was also a faithful pastor who just died recently. And he practiced a long obedience. And part of what he said in his very last interview is, my faithfulness isn't about me. It's about what I saw in God. And if I'm following God, who's going to be faithful even when I'm unfaithful, then following in the way of God means I too am going to be faithful. See, Daniel didn't make a big splash in Babylon. In fact, 3 of the last stories we read, every time he does something amazing, people forget him. How would that feel? You interpret a king's dream, go away for a few years, and the king's like, oh yeah, who interprets dreams again? He didn't make this big splash, but he was continually being promoted through the ranks of the government, arriving finally at this point as virtually the prime minister for Babylon as a Jewish slave in Babylon. You catch that? Daniel's not Babylonian. He's not Persian. He's not part of the Medes. He's a Jew in exile who's risen to the place because of his faithfulness to being over everything. The new king, the king in this chapter, Darius, who's probably also known as Cyrus, allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem to build their temple. Yet, the scriptures tell us that most of the exiles chose to stay in Babylon. They'd adapted to the Babylonian way, to the Babylonian gods, to living the customs and the lifestyle of Babylon. So this whole reculturation that we see in chapter 1, where they change the names of Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, it worked. The people who had been pulled out of Babylon just chose to stay. So after all those years of being influenced, God's people had changed, but Babylon hadn't. Hear that? The culture changed the people, not the people changing Babylon. Except this guy, Daniel, who just rolls on and remains faithful in spite of the changes going on around him. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but does the word obedience make anybody's skin crawl? Yeah? One year I picked, every year I pick a word that's going to be my intention for the year. One year I picked surrender. That was the year we got pregnant with Hazel. And it's been a constant surrender in a multitude of directions since. Words like surrender and obedience, they like get under my skin. And part of that, if I'm honest, is my own sinfulness. Right? Acknowledging that I just don't really love obedience. I don't really like people telling me what to do. I didn't like it when I was a kid with my parents. I don't like it now when my kids tell me what to do. But in this passage, Daniel is, cast into the lion's den, and he's sentenced to die for actually nothing more than being faithful to God. And Daniel faced this terrible sentence, and yet he held fast to what made him a great man. He kept faith, even knowing that obedience to God might lead him to death. So Daniel has this virtue, this thing that we call hope. Eugene Peterson says, hoping does not mean doing nothing. It's not a fatalistic resignation. Daniel just would be like, all right, to the lion's den. It means going after our assigned task, confident that God will provide the meaning and the conclusions for us. It's not compelled to work away at keeping up appearances with some form of bogus spirituality. It's the opposite of desperate and panicky manipulation or of scurrying and worrying. And hoping is not dreaming. It's not spinning an illusion or a fantasy to protect us from our boredom or our pain. It means being confident, alert expectation that God is going to do what God says God's going to do. It's an imagination put into the harness of faith. It's the willingness to let God do it God's way in God's time. It's the opposite of making plans where we demand that God put it all into effect, telling God what to do and how to do it. See, that's not hoping in God, that's bullying God. Daniel, in the midst of his faith, has this deep hope and this deep trust over 80 years that God is just gonna follow through. And how could he get there? Like, I don't know about you, but if somebody said you gotta stop praying so you don't get thrown in a lion's den, I would at least shut my windows. But Daniel doesn't. Why? Because opening his windows wasn't about him saying, oh, look at me, I'm praying. It was a command from God to pray 3 times a day, and he faced where they had been taken. So he opens his windows, recognizes that they had been ripped from their community in that direction, and that's where the temple resides, and he talks to God there 3 times a day. It wasn't new for Daniel. It wasn't something he started the few months before these guys tried to trap him. And they were so frustrated by his faithfulness that they started scheming, and literally the only way that they could catch Daniel was by his faithfulness. We don't have a lot of examples of that in our society, not even in our clergy. Definitely not in our political leaders, right? And have this person here, Daniel. Notice the details of this life that teach us about this great man of faith. So you may be asking, like, how, Rustin? How does Daniel remain faithful? How does he go about these 80 years of faithfulness? Now, part of what we saw last chapter and part of what we see in this chapter, again, the Bible tells us that Darius, the king, promoted Daniel because he had an excellent spirit. The word excellent here means preeminent. He had a preeminent spirit. Was it Daniel's spirit? You can talk back. No. It was the Holy Spirit residing within Daniel, giving Daniel the strength each day to be who God had called him to be. And it was noticeable. We all know people like that. Right? One of the things I love about St. Matthew is some of the saints who are sitting in this room today who have just faithfully plugged away at following God to the best of their ability. And if you think people in this room haven't faced adversity, you've not had enough coffees with them. Because as I sat and listened to people tell me their stories for the first 6 months of being here at the Starbucks, I heard stories about people whose children who had died by suicide, and yet they're faithful. They're holding fast, holding on. I heard stories of people who had lost their first loves in tragic ways. I heard stories of people who had lost everything, lost their job, lost their home, and remained faithful. See, there's no skeletons in Daniel's closets. There's no hidden things in his life. He lived openly. So how? How do you go about it? I think it comes down to two things. Way more than that, but only two for today. The first is perspective. Like the song that we asked God to break our heart for the things that break his. That's a perspective song. We're saying to God, God, help us to understand and to see the world the way that you see it, so that when people are hurting and pain and it touches your divine heart, that the divine heart that you place within us begins to match it and connect with it and mimic it. And we begin to be burning for the things that burn your heart. That we're not just thinking about our own microcosm of our own chaos in this moment. It'd been very easy for Daniel just to focus in on, oh man, first it was the fiery furnace, now it's this, now it's that, God, and just to double down into the pain and the suffering that he was experiencing as an exile. But instead, he looks up, and his perspective that he's taking on is the perspective of God. Daniel knows that God even loves Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon and Darius the same way that he loves him. Think about the profundity of that statement. As Mike said in the second week, it's believed that Daniel and his buddies were not only brought into Babylon, but they were castrated and disempowered and forced to learn other languages, because that's what the Babylonians did when they brought people in. And yet, he believes that God loves Nebuchadnezzar and wants Nebuchadnezzar and wants a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. That's perspective. And that's why I think we see in Daniel this deep commitment to prayer. For him, this conversation with God is the only thing that could loop him back around to being and placing himself in the perspective of God. It's what centered him. It's why we see it over and over and over in this book. But the second thing that we see is that Daniel made choices. So it's not just about our perspective. You can have this perspective of God and then never make a choice in that direction. But a long obedience in the same direction means that we walk that way. That we move in the way that we see God moving. We see it over and over, but in this chapter, what we see Daniel making some essential choices. He chose obedience to God over opportunities in the world. He chose to remain faithful to God and to not bow down in chapter 1. To not eat the food in chapter 1, but to be faithful, even though doing this could get him in trouble. Another choice we see in this is that he chose faithfulness to God over favor for a king. And yet, he still gets favor from the king. Because this is part of how God works, right? When the world's sowing chaos around us, God is consistently sowing shalom and goodness, right? Shalom means everything that's good. When we say shalom to you, what I'm saying is I wish everything that is good in the world on you. And this is what God is sowing in the world around Daniel, so much so that this spirit that's living within him brings favor from a king, even though he's choosing faithfulness to God. He chooses again and again devotion to God over the decrees of the land. They keep telling him that he has to behave this way, and Daniel says, nope, not going to do it. He chose bowing before God instead of bowing before his enemies. It's been really easy for him not to go to the lion's den. But instead, he just kept praying, kept his faithfulness in the same direction. Daniel chose commitment over compromise. He even chose love over his own life. I didn't say the decisions were going to be easy. If you need a more recent example of somebody like Daniel, there's this great guy named Jesus that we tend to follow who does the same. He chooses love over his own life. In fact, the disciples at the last point as Jesus is heading back to Jerusalem literally stand up in front of him and say, Jesus, if you go any further, you're going to die. And he says, Peter, get behind me, Satan. Because love is worth all of this. Daniel chose character over comfort. I don't like this one. I like comfort. I want a comfortable house. I want a comfortable car. I want a comfortable job. I want comfortable clothes. That's why I'm wearing jeans today. Right? We're built to settle for comfort. But Daniel chooses character. He sees that God has called him to be this person, and Daniel takes choice after choice after choice to become that person. Again, I don't want to stand up here and say, this is all easy, but I do want to say that we do have people in this church who have done this. Some of you sitting here right now could teach me how to do this because you keep making faithful decisions. And it doesn't mean we're perfect. Like, don't believe that Daniel was perfect. He wasn't. I'm sure he got off and made some bad decisions in the midst of these 80 years. He's just the one that's helping catalog this stuff down, right? You tell your story the way that you need to tell your story. But I love that we have examples of Daniels in our church today and Danielette's in our church today. I long that God would allow me the courage to live a life of faithfulness for 80 years like my grandfather, who for 86 years just faithfully plugged along, believing that God had a purpose and plan for each piece of this existence, and that God didn't cause the pain that my grandfather felt. God didn't cause my grandmother's dementia and Alzheimer's, but that God was loving them in the midst of it. God didn't even allow it. God was with them in the midst of it. So how beautiful that God would give us the grace as men and women and folks who would settle for nothing less than absolute faithfulness to the movement of God for our lives. But our culture, it teaches us that we should give up way too easy. God doesn't need a lot of Porsches. He doesn't need a bunch of Ferraris. He needs a lot of faithful family sedans who are going to faithfully walk in choice by choice with his perspective to shape and mold the world over the course of history. That's our challenge. That's what Daniel teaches us. That's what we're being called to. So may we be a good family sedan. Please pray with me. God, obedience is simple and it's hard. Give us the courage Give us the strength. Give us the fortitude to walk faithfully, decision by decision, with your perspective, with your eyes and your heart, guiding us the entire way. God, may St. Matthew be known as a place of faithful saints who are walking step by step into your direction, surrounded by your grace, filled with your forgiveness, as we walk this long obedience in the same direction.